Welcome everyone to our first MAXForum conversation of the fall. In fact, our first MAXForum conversation live, because we produced 2 series in the pandemic, which you can catch online on our YouTube channel. And please come back and join us for the next 2 conversations, November 2nd and 16th. I'm Kay Matchalot. I'm a theater director and creative producer, and I founded Media Art Xploration, and known as MAX. And at MAX, we gather together artists, creative technologists, and scientists to create work around the most pressing and exciting issues of our time, to grapple with that science and technology, to thrill audiences with it, and to explore what it's doing to us. So I'm really excited to have these artists and artists moderating for us today. We support our mission with this interdisciplinary exploration and production through our Max Machina residency program, and we will open up applications for a new cohort next month, so keep your eye out for that. And new commissions in our Max Live is our biennial live arts festival, where the Max Machina work shows along with other work, and this MAXForum conversation series. So we have this range of programming, so please join us for all of it. So tonight, I want to thank Salome Asega and Raoul Ben-Getch from New Inc. and Vallejo Gartner from ONX Studio, our partners in this, and they've helped produce and promote this. And mostly I want to thank them for their collegial spirits and brilliant minds. They're really a really great partner, so thank you. And thanks to Joe and Matthew Niederhauser, who are the hearts and minds of this place in a way, and production support, so thanks to them. And Science Sandbox for making Max Machina Laboratory possible, and where these artists are making work right now. And I ask you to join us for refreshments afterward, and on the bar, you'll see a QR code that leads you to our donate page. And we appreciate any donation to help support the work. So I want to start by introducing Ryan York, our moderator. We're delighted to have Ryan. He's a biologist and multidisciplinary artist from California. His wide-ranging scientific and artistic work is broadly concerned with the effect of time on complex systems, both natural and artificial. Ryan earned a PhD at Stanford and has worked at UCLA, Caltech, and Stanford. He is currently a researcher and meta-scientist at Arcadia Science in Berkeley, California. His research explores how organisms evolve behaviors using diverse tools from evolution, genetics, cell biology, and neuroscience. I'm so lucky to be hanging out with these people. So he has a particular focus on generating computational models of organismal movement, including that of humans, and has authored over a dozen scientific publications. He's also he's not a museum. No. He's a musician, producer, and film composer, and is currently a part of Nali Mishima, a collaborative effort using the tension between improvisation and composition to produce new sound and visual art. And we have with us Lisa Jamhoury, is a Lebanese-American movement artist and programmer creating embodied computational experiences. Rooted in contemporary circus and mindfulness as means to engage trauma, her practice includes interactive performances, installations, and websites that encourage a consensual, celebratory approach to humanity's shared physicality. She's a member of the New Museum's New Inc. Extended Realities track, and recently completed residencies with the 2021 session of the Conference on Movement and Computing and NYU's Interactive Telecommunications program, where she completed her master's and is an adjunct arts professor, and we are delighted to have her as a Max Machina 2022 artist in residence. As an aerial acrobat, Lisa has choreographed and performed across the United States, including commissioned work for the Strep Lab for Action Mechanics in TEDx Brooklyn. Her computational work has been recognized by Ars Electronica, Meta Open Arts, Contemporary Art Society, Culture Hub, Google NYU, X-Story, and others. And thank you, Lisa, for being here. Mimi Yin is an artist and educator. Her work experiments with unconventional modes of interaction in performance and participatory experiences. and has been presented on Governor's Island off the High Line, Yale University Art Gallery, Gibney Dance, Dance Space in St. Mark's, Manor Contemporary and Culture Hub, among others. Her research into choreographic practice and interactive media is being supported by the NEA Artworks Grant. She's been an artist in residence at the Movement Lab in Barnard College with the artist collective NUM, and it is a spring 2019 fellow at the Center for Ballet and the Arts at NYU. She's an assistant professor at NYU's Interactive Telecommunication Program. And we are proud to say Mimi is 2021 Max Machina resident with the NUM collective. And their work, Doppelgänger, which premiered at Max Live 2021, the Neuroverse, will be presented at the Boston Museum of Science in October. So before we start, I want to acknowledge that we are holding this event on the unceded land of the Lenape people, with the further acknowledgement that stewardship of this land needs addressing and improvement. And without further ado, I'm going to hand the evening over to this terrific trio. Thank you.
Thanks, Kay, for that great introduction. I'm really excited to be here tonight, taking part in this, and to get to chat with these two incredible artists. And are all our microphones on? Yeah, that's good. Hello. This is working? Hello. Okay. Good. Yeah, cool. We were a little bit worried about that. I don't think it's on.
No.
You got to hold it down. Oh. That's green.
It's green.
Oh, that's green.
It's green. It's good.
It's good. Okay, cool. We're good. All right. Cool. So to start tonight, we're going to begin with sharing some recent work and then getting into talking about the process behind it and hopefully getting into some interesting issues and commonalities and differences in all of our work. So I think, Mimi, you have some to show to start.
So I'm going to just talk through two works that I think are especially relevant to tonight's panel. The first is a piece that's kind of nominally called 1920 by 1920. It's basically referencing the resolution of the two projectors that we knit together for the floor projection. This piece explores the intersection of the human body, which is very organic, and not very geometric, with very simple, almost brutalist kind of geometric shapes and lines that are animating and like generatively on the ground. This is just a small clip from one of them. This particular one has a lot of texture and movement, but a lot of the other shapes and forms we're working with are pure lines or straight-edged rectangles of light and dark, or triangles. The next piece. This piece, which I think is going to be the one that we're going to probably focus on more, is in many ways the opposite. Whereas the first one, the dancers are mostly in shadow and it's really about their silhouettes with these large scale geometries. This one is really like a close-up shot of a very real photorealistic human body. There's actually a real person on stage. And then a second doppelganger that is generated by a live feed. And the setup is basically trying to fabricate a duet out of a solo. And so it's not just in sync, but using various algorithms creates sort of a dialogue between the two bodies in space. Some of those algorithms are using things as sophisticated as subtraction. Other ones are using things as sophisticated as multiplication. And then, there's stuff that's dependent on machine learning and post-classification to pull things back from much further back in time. So most of it is very simple, straightforward time delay algorithms. Most of the work has to do in how you choreograph in such a simple form in order to create that dynamic. So I have like a very short clip here. This is the opening. This is kind of like the palette, cleanser. It's just to kind of slow you down and kind of help you see the really basic relationships that will be created, which will then be sped up and layered and become more complex over the course of the 40 minutes. So if we could just play this video. Is there sound? There is sound plugged in.
A friend of mine once told me that a true conversation must, by necessity, travel long distances of silence.
So we can skip over the next two because they're more visual aids for later in the conversation.
Okay. Well, great. Thanks.
I'm done.
Cool. And then Lisa, I think you have a couple things to share too.
Sure. Am I on? Yeah. Okay, great. So there are three works that I want to show today. In thinking about movement mapping, and they're three very different works. One of them, the first one that I'll show, is called Maquette, which is the project. Actually, it's very meta because it is in this space. It was created and performed in this space. So you'll be watching a video of a performance happening where you're sitting right now. This is it. So Maquette, this is the project that I'm currently working on. It's under development with the Max residency. And it features a duet of two contemporary circus performers. They're wearing motion capture suits, and they're here in the OptiTrack motion capture system. I'm taking live readings from their performance and averaging them throughout the performance in different ways. And the idea sort of behind this project is thinking about the use of averaging in user experience, but also as an artistic tool. So let's go ahead and roll the clip. There should be audio. So that's just sort of one short bit of what is currently a 3-scene piece, which I think we'll probably talk more about throughout the throughout the panel tonight. The second piece that I wanted to show is from a piece that's very much in development, and I'll show about a 1-minute clip from our rehearsal yesterday. So this is very fresh, very raw, very quick and dirty, as we like to say in the program that I teach at. But I think that it's interesting relating to this topic because it is a telematic project. I'm actually developing it right now under the New Ink and Meta Open Arts Next Web grant. But the idea behind it is that I'm actually working with a team in Burlington, Vermont, where I'm based, and then working with a team in Santiago de Chile, where we have a technologist, musician, and a local dancer. And we're actually taking readings from dancers in the two spaces in real time, sending them onto a website together, and then working on these visualizations based on the data that's coming from the two different places. So this is a project so the project that you just saw is using this very fancy OptiTrack system that we have here to do movement mapping. But then this clip that I'll show now, Olos, is using just webcams and simple web graphics and things. So I think it's an interesting counterpoint to this project. And then the third project that I want to show is a project that I did about, I think 5 or 6 years ago at this point. It's a project called Movement and Code, 100 Days of Movement and Code. It's a project where I took 100 days and 50 of the days I did movement work and 50 of the days I coded in response to it. So I started on day 1 and I did an acrobatic sequence. And then on day 2, I sat down at my computer and I wrote code sort of inspired by that movement. And the idea was, I have a movement background as a circus performer, and it's really where I feel my creative space, my creative energy comes out very easily through my body and through body movement. But sitting down on a computer, it doesn't necessarily flow so easily. And so the idea of the project was to kind of see if I could take that creative impulse that came so naturally through the body movement and translate that into code or to like logic and programming. And I think it's an interesting project in the sense that there's no machine learning or fancy cameras, but it's actually my brain that is doing the movement mapping as opposed to some algorithm on a computer. And I think it's again something potentially interesting for our conversation today. So there's no audio on this one, and it'll just be some quick clips.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing. I think there's gonna be a lot to dig into tonight on that. And so we're tasked with exploring the art of movement mapping tonight and delving into that. So I think as like a first place to get going there, we might want to cover what movement mapping means. So I was thinking it might be nice for us to all go through and talk about what that means to us, and how that plays a role in our work. And maybe part of that too might be kind of giving like a high level technical walkthrough of how you implement it in your practice. So yeah, I think that would be a cool place to start and get this going.
Guess I'm going first.
Yeah.
Okay. I would say that I use movement mapping in a pretty rudimentary way. So for me, it really is just converting certain aspects of movement into numbers, and with the hope that when you make it so specific, because we all can see movement, but the ways that our brains process that movement is not so precise. We kind of feel the general energy of it, the postures. We read a lot of emotion into it. But once you strip it down to the numbers, there are other patterns that become more apparent that are structural. And in the first piece that you saw with the floor geometries, we're really working with it almost as the body is just doing object recognition and object tracking. We are interested in location and sort of acceleration and trajectory orientation. The only thing that is really specific to a body versus, tracking a ball on the ground is really just the front-back asymmetry, right? So understanding the facing of the mover in sort of 360 in a sphere-like way. But we're not really looking at skeletal structure or posture or gesture or anything like that. In the second piece, it's kind of the opposite extreme. We really are, that piece is figurative, it's sculptural, right? So you can almost think of it as a work of sculpture where you're moving, it's like stop motion sculpture. You're like moving the sculpture in time and trying to find all these interesting combinations of sculptures. In the last talk I did, I showed a whole bunch of salt and pepper shakers because that's sort of like a really good metaphor for that kind of thinking. And in that case, we are more interested in the body structure. But again, the movement mapping we're doing is still limited to, anywhere, depending on what system you're using, sort of 20 to 50 points, which is really a tiny, tiny number when you think about all of the possible points in your body that you are physically conscious of, that you can actually actively control, not to mention the stuff that is being sort of handled subconsciously by your brain, right? So it's a super stripped down representation of the body. But with that, we want to kind of highlight the structural elements of choreography that maybe sometimes get lost as we're reading all of the emotion and all of the energy, which is why the opening, and then it kind of gets repeated at the end of the piece, is very still, very slow, and really wants you to see all of the differences between like straight front and even just a slight tweak of the knee, and even just the way that the three of us are related to each other. What points are similar, kind of in resonance, which ones are diverging. Even though we're all in seated positions, there's constant tension of coming together and moving apart from each other. And that's sort of the movement mapping in there, is trying to tease out those really tiny distinctions to kind of focus your attention.
I really like this idea of kind of tuning what you track to fit the project. And I'm interested too, like, do you have a decision-making process? I guess this is for kind of both of you, like around deciding what to map for your project. Is it principled, or is it kind of limited by the technology that you're using for that project? Or is it something you figure out as you go? Because for me, we always want to track as much as we possibly can in the science world. And you would like, basically you track the minimal amount that you can get away with, but we never think about throwing away data. But I love this idea of like artistically, intentionally doing that. You know what I mean? Like to get at something that's more emotive. So yeah, how is that decision-making process? Like, how does that play out?
Do you want to answer? No, you go first.
Well, yes, should I answer the first part and then come back to the second part?
Sorry,
So,
yeah.
yeah, no, it's good. So it's interesting. I think for me, the reason that I do this and the thing that I'm always thinking about is representation in the virtual or the digital world. So for me, it's just kind of become an obsession about how are we represented in our computers? How do our computers see us? Are they respecting our bodies? Are they, are we respecting our bodies as we're using them in relationship with our computers? How are we moving, or how are we kind of thinking about our bodies in relationship to our computers? And so for me, I always come to my projects through this lens of really thinking about the representation of the person in this space. And I think that depending on what I'm thinking about, so, for example, in the first project that I showed, Maquette, I'm really thinking about averaging, right? And so thinking about averaging, it brought me to a tool where I really actually, I wanted to work with averaging. I wanted to work with circus performers. So I needed a tool that was really high end because if you see the types of backbends and handstands they're doing, there aren't a lot of motion capture systems that can do that. So this is amazing to be able to have access to something like the system here at ONX, for example. But it's that idea of wanting to be able to have this very precise averaging and wanting to play with that would bring me to the decision about the technology there and and how I would be implementing it and the type of data I would be collecting. With the second project that I showed, for example, OLOS, which is based on this idea of how do we get bodies to connect across distance online, in a creative way, or in a way that would, in ways that we're not used to connecting online, right? In fuller, creative, expressive, emotive ways. With that, it's interesting because, of course, just working on the web dictates you need to work with a certain type of technology. But with this, it's interesting. I feel like the technology is more dictating the project than in Maquette. There were sort of a bunch of ways I could go about it. With this, it's really it's such a new space of working on the web with pose data that I really needed to think about, what are my options? Okay, I have two. And so this is the best that I can do, sort of thing. And so I think that, it's interesting in that sense how the tech really sort of decided for me what I would be collecting and how I would be collecting it. And so for that, I'm actually using Blaze Pose, which was released open source by Google in TensorFlow.js, which is sort of all relatively new open source web-based tools for doing pose detection online.
Yeah, it's kind of mind-blowing how well that seemed to work in that video. Yeah.
It's interesting because for my graduate research, I actually worked on getting the Microsoft Kinect, if you all know what that is, online. It was there wasn't a way to get pose detection online. And so I worked on that several years ago and sort of how do we get any of this data online? And now it's amazing. Fast forward 5 or 6 years, whatever it is. And Google has this really stable, really fast algorithm doing 3D pose detection. We're moving fast.
That kind of brings me to a question that I was going to probably bring up later, but I think it might be worth bringing up now, is this interesting interplay that I think you have as being a technologist and an artist. So developing tools for getting human motion online. But I think a lot of your work also questions the implications of that. And especially the idea of representation in the metaverse. So I think it might be interesting to talk a little bit about that too here. Basically, and one thing I've been wondering is how does that inform your daily practice or your ongoing artistic practice? Is there a conflict in your head around those two? Or are you yielding the tools to try to show it as this is the proper way we should be using these things? Are you trying to influence the space, or is it trying to just draw people to the inherent conflict between those two, like accelerating the process, but also maybe having some anxieties about it.
I guess maybe to answer that first and then Mimi to respond. I think for me, I think that this is the role of artists, is to be asking the questions of society and to be really pushing on the places where we could be doing better, or we could be having more creative exploration. And so I think that is a huge part of my practice. I came into doing this work actually because I started having a lot of back and hip problems. It was from a car accident in my youth, but then exacerbated by working on the computer too much. And I remember thinking at the time, aren't these, why am I having problems sitting at the computer? The people making these computers are, of course, thinking about my well-being. They're thinking about my body, it's right. And it's funny because it seems so naive now to look back and realize like, no, they weren't. But, but at the time I remember feeling that, and it's sort of been for me, the like coming through that sort of embodied trauma and then thinking about the relationship between my body and the computer has been the thing that has really made me want to probe this relationship. Because I think it's an important one, especially as we are spending more and more and more and more time on our computers. And now sort of with this excitement and this big push to be in the metaverse, to be physically in the metaverse, to be represented with avatars in the metaverse, I think I'm really interested in having those conversations about how we're represented. And so I guess, yes, to answer your question, this is why I make the work. I think there are these two artists that I love who were doing early telematic work named Sherry Robinowitz and Kit Galloway. They were working in the late 1970s and early 80s doing work with NASA, sort of very, very early telecommunications work. But they talked about their role as artists as making models for the future. And I think that that's a really nice way of thinking about it, as like our role as artists is to be pushing these conversations through our work and putting out into the world these questions and these ideas of how things could potentially be different than they are right now, or what they could look like in the future.
Yeah, Mimi, what are your feelings about that?
I'm realizing, thank you. I'm realizing that I'm mostly running away from the problem because actually it's interesting what you were saying about throwing out data, because that's definitely actively what we're doing. Actually, I would like to show that second clip. I'm going to explain a little bit about it. We are literally throwing out all of the data except for the data about your nose. And because the movement there's a lot of this kind of movement. So the nose is the fastest moving joint on the body. And we're simply using it, I think the reason why we're throwing all this data out is because we're not trying to understand anything about the movement. We're not trying to understand anything about the body. We're definitely not trying to model it. We're only using it as an instrument, right? So in an analog world, I might have a ribbon or I might have a stick that I'm like flailing around to control something else. So here, this is a visualization, so it's not from the performance. It shows what the computer is seeing, and this is actually tracking more joints. We eventually got rid of all of them except for the nose. The trails that you see, the longer the trail, it means that the faster the movement was happening. And that speed of the movement is basically functioning as a scrubbing button to fast forward and rewind the time delay on the right side. So the live performer is the person on the left. The right is the video feed that's time delayed. And the speed of the movement, the faster she goes, the slower the doppelganger goes. And the slower she goes, the faster the doppelganger goes. And that is the sort of timing trick that we're using to kind of create some sort of interplay between the two movers. So if we play this.
What's the tool you're using for the motion mapping here?
This is MoveNet. This is the thing that Lisa's talking about, that you can do this on the internet. You can do this at home. It's very easy to use. I teach it in the introductory programming class. So the students who've been programming for a grand total of 12 weeks are using this at the end. And all we're really trying to do with this motion data is to capture some essence of the emotional state of the performer, so that we can give the feed, which is ostensibly just a direct replica of the performer, right? It's just time delayed, something slightly different, right? So by adjusting like the pacing of the movement, which is very repetitive, the doppelganger ends up having a different emotional experience than the originator of the movement, even though the underlying movement is exactly the same between the two.
I love this idea of the nose bridge being the most emotive part of your body. It's like so counterintuitive,
it's for this movement,
right?
Like your question is like it is very tailored to the specific choreography. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like that's so similar to, in a lot of cases, what we think about in the lab when we're trying to get at, say we're studying some phenomenon, like some type of movement, say in a human, and like people do this in the clinical context, right? When they're studying people who are developing Parkinson's, they try to find the discrete types of movement that are indicators of early onset Parkinson's. And so you're trying to reduce the whole body's movement to a single output. And often I think a lot of the work now has to do with like accelerometers that people wear. You can even do it with your cell phone, and you can kind of get a sense of somebody's developing tremors just from that. And it seems somewhat analogous, or it's like you theoretically could map the whole body if you wanted to, but really you just need to pay attention to this small bit of it. And that's the most useful data here. So you're actually okay throwing out the rest of the data. But I love this idea of like trying to play with that as a way to get at your output, or, you know, whatever your goal is there. Could we get a quick walkthrough of what the tool in here is? Because I don't know much about it, and I think I'm pretty interested because it seems like it is like pretty cutting edge for motion mapping.
Yeah. So this tool is amazing. This is called the OptiTrack system. So the cameras are actually off right now. I kind of like when they're on because they glow blue, and they kind of have this pulse to them, which I find very comforting watching them. But if you look very closely, you can see these sort of white circles all around us. Those are the cameras. There are 16 of them, and they're part of the OptiTrack system. So to use this system, the performers need to be in suits. They're usually Velcro suits, and then you add these knobs, these reflective knobs to the suits in specific locations. And then all of these cameras track those knobs in real time. They work really, really quickly, and then that you essentially track the movement of the people in the space. It's really an amazing system, and it's one of the very few, the only system that I know that can track a really deep back bend or contortion handstand. So it's amazing to have access to one here.
And what makes those movements difficult to track is just things are getting occluded as the performer is bending over, and they lose the, yeah. Yeah,
so I mean, it's a really great and interesting question. So, you know, the thing with machine learning, or, you know, machine learning algorithms is that they're trained on data sets, and data sets are made up of people doing things that people normally do, which is stand on two legs, walk or run, or maybe sit down, or, you know, there are the things that we're all used to doing. Show of hands, how many of you have done a contortion handstand today? Okay. Not me, although I did do one handstand today, but it wasn't a contortion one. Not right now, at least. But so it's interesting because, you know, most of the algorithms that are out there to detect human pose, are really based on the things that we normally do. And those are not the things that a lot of performers are normally doing. The nice thing about this system is it's actually yes, it's doing a lot of, there's a lot of software that is recognizing the body and the form of the body. There's a lot to that in it, and it's part of why it's so good. But it's also paying a lot of attention to where the knobs are. So it actually will default more to the shape of the body and where it's actually seeing the knobs than to what it thinks the human body should be doing. So there are points, and it's interesting. One of the performers, Nikki, she can like backbend and hit her head to her back. I mean, her back is insane. That will break the system because it's just too much. Like the system just can't handle it. But for the most part, if it can see the knobs on her back and the knobs on her head and on her shoulders, it will trust that, yes, she's doing that really deep back bend, even though it hasn't really seen much of that before.
I'm trying to think about how I could put a James Cameron and Avatar joke in here, but I don't know. I can't.
You can try and I'll laugh.
Yeah, the second one's underwater, which is supposed to be pretty cool. Anyway, so actually that's an interesting idea, that like this limitation of machine learning too, based on what the models are trained on. And it seems like that is something maybe that you both have confronted, like in this specific case, but just in general, how often does that come up in your work too, where you're almost maybe manipulating the fact that this is like a undertrained or too like overfit model or something like that? I guess, what is the role of machine learning in general in the work that you're doing currently?
I think for us, maybe we'll show that last clip. We are definitely playing with the limitations. For me personally, the most interesting is always going to be the structure versus the texture of your body. And so this is something we play with at the very end of the piece, where we return to the same structures as the opening of the piece, right? These very clear kind of seated postures, but the texture of the body has completely changed because she's gone through this sort of emotional roller coaster over the course of the 40 minutes. The audience can see the textural change, right? She's less kind of formal, less held. She's more relaxed, maybe tired, more giving in to the shape rather than actively defining the shape. But that is not something that MoveNet can pick up at all. And so then what that allows us to do is create choreography where she's essentially holding these poses for long periods of time in her new state of mind. And then what gets pulled up on the doppelganger are clips from much earlier in the performance at the beginning, where she's doing very similar poses with a completely different state of mind. So Ryan, if we could just play that last video and illustrate. Yeah.
Do y'all want me to move? Can you see the screen okay? You're okay? Okay.
Thank you, YouTube.
30 row. Yeah, so you can really see how it's kind of breaking down in real time. And how much of this is improvised, if at all, in this performance here? The
last section is probably the most improvised. She does have sort of those sort of postures that she needs to hit. But when she hits them, how long she stays and how she transitions between them, you know, it changes every time. Yeah.
Yeah, and you have a musical background, right? And so do you think about that formally when you're putting these together as like a composed versus an improvised component to the overall piece? Or?
Yeah, so I was actually excited to hear the little blurb about your musical exploits, because to me, that's essentially what we're playing with, is composed improvisation, structured improvisation. And I think, you know, everything that I'm talking about in terms of the dialogue between the two bodies, I think of in terms of this musical idea called counterpoint. And counterpoint is essentially the interplay of harmony and melody in dialogue with each other. And it's all structural, meaning you can hear the emotive quality of counterpoint when it's a MIDI program playing a piece of music, because all of that is in the composition. It doesn't need a great performer to be expressive. Or you can hear the emotion just in how the notes are kind of relating to each other. And then you have and sometimes the added, you know, live performance kind of takes your attention away from that, because you're so caught up in the human that's in front of you, that's expressive, that you don't really see as clearly the structure. And so a lot of this piece is about trying to pull back that kind of human emotive quality so that you see the structure, which is why the compositional structure of the time delay is so in your face, right? It's the time delay. And in the beginning, it's like super straightforward. It's like just 4 seconds behind. And we let you kind of see that delay very obviously before we start playing with it to create kind of confusion around it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we're both playing with this idea of sort of letting the machine work and then eventually it breaking down. And maybe we can cue the video. I think that it was it's called Scene 2 from Maquette, and in the notes it says, yes, this is it. So maybe I'll explain real quick before we play it. So Maquette is based on this idea of averaging in computation and design. And this came from actually the work that I was doing some years back at Adobe on the machine intelligence design team, where I was working on a high-level team, and we were really thinking about how machine learning should and could be used in creative processes. And I got deep into research on inclusive design, and which brought me to learning a lot about averaging and the way that averaging is used in design, sort of out in the real world, in chairs and kitchens and education design, and sort of it's everywhere. But for me, because I'm a software designer, for me, it was very interesting within this space of software design. And, you know, it's problematic in the sense that if you think about it, you know, we're all very individual. And then when you start making software based on averages, it's, you know, not really made for any of us, but it's made for some sort of baseline that we all can sort of get to. But, you know, it's why a lot of people have problems using computers, or can't get their software to work, or really hate their phone, right? Because it's not really made for you, right? It was made for some people sort of like you, right? And so that's what this piece is about. It's really thinking about that idea, but as we move into the metaverse and as we continue to sort of reduce ourselves into these sort of virtual spaces and virtual representations, you know, what are we losing? What humanity are we losing? What pieces of ourselves and our movements and our creativity are we losing? So what happens in Maquette is the first scene is this sort of beautiful representation of averaging, but then in the second scene, the scene and the avatar dissolves into this metaverse scene where it kind of falls apart into 100 representations that are all being made out of different averages. And the choreography changes so that rather than the two performers actually working together to create something beautiful, they're now doing really divergent choreography, which is essentially breaking down the avatars. And so maybe we can roll the clip and you can see what that looks like.
So I'm kind of struck by how these technologies that, in a lot of ways are rigid or can be they're often characterized as like being rigid or cold or predictive, can actually bring new sources of kind of randomness and almost humanness into this work and kind of like a sense of the uncanny a little bit. Do you find that when you're doing this, and are there ways that you can kind of engineer trying to make the uncanny more present through using technology? Because I definitely, with some of my music practice, have explored that too. Like I love that idea of there being, this external source that you can't really control as the composer yourself, that's going to force you to react to it in some way, and opening up. And it's this weird almost paradox of like technology bringing us closer to like what the human performer is doing. Like, is that a theme that resonates with you in your work? And yeah, would be interested to hear about that.
Yeah, I mean, the basic trope we're working with in Doppelganger is she's looking at me, right? Like, it's this video and it's looking at me, and then I look at her and we look away at the same time. And was that on purpose? And who's responding to who, right? And I would say that some of that is because of the technology. Both the very simple algorithm and then also in the machine learning post classification. But I would say that for both of our work, the critical factor is not really the technology, but like we're seeing something, right? And we're seeing some relationship, we're seeing something that needs to be highlighted. And then we're kind of forcing it to happen. And right, like you're making these choreographic choices that are forcing the breakdown. And if you didn't have an understanding of the body and what is a divergent, did this turn off again? No? Okay, still not close enough. Okay. If you didn't have that understanding of what divergent bodies actually means, you wouldn't be able to create that effect in the avatar. So at the end of the day, we're doing that both as the creator of the work, but then also there's the intelligence of the audience involved, right? Like this is only interesting because the audience also has body knowledge and can also empathize with what they are seeing in their own body. And that there's that desire to like understand and the desire to connect with the bodies that you see. And then the weirdness of almost connecting with the other thing that's not the real body. So it's like the machine part of it is really at the end of the day, just like another screwdriver that you're working with that's like sitting in the middle of all of this shared like cognitive stuff.
Can you unpack the term body knowledge? I really like that.
Body knowledge?
Yeah. Is that like an embodied cognition kind of thing?
It's embodied. I mean, it's everything from just basic proprioception. Like, I know I have this arm and therefore I can move it around. I'm aware of my back, even though I cannot see it. Right. To kind of prediction and understanding, even if I'm just seeing something and I'm not actually doing it myself, right? I can feel the rush of somebody who's sprinting. I mean, I can't, when we're watching like ice skaters and like really amazing athletes, but there have been studies, right, where if you do the thing that you're watching, you're actually more able to connect with it. If you're a professional dancer and you're watching somebody else do a dance move, you can really feel it in a way that somebody who isn't trained can't quite feel it. So the more that and which is also why doppelgängers, a lot of the doppelganger vocabulary is very pedestrian, is because we want to kind of maximize that connection. Yeah.
There are a couple of things I want to respond to. I guess first, to answer the question about the uncanny, there's a machine learning artist whose work I really enjoy. Her name is Anna Riddler, and we spoke a couple years back about her work, and she's really well known for, she creates her own data sets and then she does her own training sort of on her one computer sitting in her living room, and it takes a month to do the training, and it's this really nice manual process. And she said about her work that it's always interesting to her to kind of check up on what's going on in the training and in the results that are coming out, sometimes sort of farther along in the process. And when she looks at it, it's like that feeling when you are walking down the hallway and you catch a glimpse in the mirror, and it's you, but there's that moment where you didn't know it was you, and you're sort of like, whoa, who is that person? And she says that she feels that way about the work a lot of times. When she first sees it, she's like, oh, this is really familiar. This is something that I recognize, but this is also something that is like not of me. And I think to me, it's a really beautiful way to talk about the relationship between sort of why to make art with computers, or how to probe the relationship between humans and computers. And it's the space that I'm really interested in exploring and keeping us in. I think that it's very important as an artist to continue to probe that sort of uncanny space, and to not let us get comfortable, and to not look at the computer and just see the reflection back and be like, okay, I'm totally fine with this, and everything that's happening in this computer is reality. And, for me, it's very important that we look at our computers and we see the uncanny, and we're like, whoa, what is that weird thing over my shoulder? So I think that has, that's a lot. That informs a lot of the work that I'm doing. There was something I wanted to respond to, and now I'm trying to remember what it was.
Body knowledge?
Yes, body knowledge. So this is really interesting. Thank you. So I do work in physical spaces, but I've been doing a lot of work over the years in telematic space with the body as well. And it's a space I'm very interested in because I think, as Myron Kruger says, Myron Kruger was doing a lot of sort of early telematic work as well in the 1980s and 1990s. He talks about what he calls the third space. So in telecommunications, as Myron Kruger says, there are the two physical spaces that exist. And then he says there's a third space, which is the space that is made up of the information that is available to the two communicating parties. So essentially what he's saying is like, yes, there are these two spaces, but there is actually a space that exists that is neither of those physical spaces, right? That is the place that these two people are communicating, right? And so it's like, it's somewhere in the ether. And I think to me, it's like the space that I'm very obsessed with, in how do we get our bodies into that space and how do we interact in that space? And it's really interesting in this, the second clip that I showed from Olos, where I've been working with these dancers over the past month now in Chile and in Burlington. Because after our first rehearsal, the dancer in Chile said, and I mean, I was like, wow, I wish I recorded that. But she goes, oh, you know, this was really weird. It was like I wasn't in my body. I wasn't out of my body. I was in this third space where I was in some extension of my body that was not me, but also not foreign to me. And it is really interesting, like how our technology does bring us out of ourselves. And I think in some ways that's dangerous, and it's something that, you know, I like to think that it's, you know, this is why I go for a lot of walks in between programming sessions. But I think that there's also something incredibly fascinating about the sort of extension of our physical presence that we can really feel in another space or in a virtual space, in some physical capacity.
Can I hijack this? If I know you probably have another question, but this is
Please.
bringing up something related. It's not quite the same, but it occurred to me when you're talking about, you know, I'm imagining you sitting in front of your computer, how frontal we are with screen-based things. We're very, very aware of, we're already much more aware of our front than our back, but especially in a screen-based kind of world where everything is interacted with this way, we're kind of losing our proprioceptive awareness of what's behind us. And doppelganger is especially like all about the front, right? So that first piece, sorry, Ryan, that first piece that it has like a video attached to it, I'll just show a little bit of it. That one, because the projection is on the floor, is really about all 360 space and the backspace. And the dance partner is not another body. I mean, there are multiple bodies in the space, but the real dance partner is the geometries. And can you sense things behind you that aren't other bodies, right? Because there's some predictive force where you have a memory, you've traversed space, you have a memory of something having been there, you have a memory of the rate at which it reoccurs in that location. And so a lot of the interaction is kind of about you turning away from something and then turning around at the right moment in time to like actually interact with that thing. So if we don't have to play the whole thing, but just play a little bit of it. So you might have seen that a lot of the interactions are, sorry, that was a sudden mic. A lot of the interactions are happening behind you, right? So some block of light is closing behind you out of sight, but you have a memory of that space and you have a memory of how that space is changing. And so you're sort of responding to it. And I'm sort of curious, you know, with the sort of development of this third space, whether we kind of grow new proprioceptive neurons to negotiate. I think we are already, right, to negotiate the virtual space that is different from, what our ancestors had when we were all living in caves.
Yeah, that's something I thought about watching both of your work too, is that you could really manipulate someone's sensory environment in a way that maybe a human couldn't handle. Like if you were to face 2,000 doppelgängers of yourself at the same time, or avatars in some kind of space, like that's a pretty interesting place to think about. Also, like cognitively and from like a brain perspective too, like how much of that can you handle, and how much can we push ourselves to potentially, I don't know, intuit the environment in a different way. It's kind of an interesting place to potentially play with there. I think we're getting close to time for tonight. So is there anything else that you'd like to cover, or should we go to questions from the audience?
I just two-sentence response to what Mimi brought up, because it's really actually a big part of, because especially with the telematic work, which is so screen-based, it's very full, like frontal. And interestingly, Hannah, our dancer in Burlington, Vermont, we did a sort of debrief interview with her a couple of days ago, and she was like, I took the biggest sigh of relief when they said we couldn't turn around anymore, because they're trying to choreograph together, and it was really hard to do spins or turns and to lose the connection with the other person. But it is really interesting how much it impacts the experience and their, and their choreography.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. So I guess we can open up for questions. If anybody has one, feel free to yell it out, and we'll yell back and answer.
I was interested by your bringing up the notion of averaging in the way that many facets of design that we interact with, not just, I guess, digital or virtual ones. But I guess I'm aware of a lot of the work that's going into making sort of more believable versions of the metaverse are trying to actually make more tailored versions of your movements that do less averaging, that sort of learn more of the mapping between your intention and what you're trying to represent there. And although averaging has its uncomfortable aspects, I feel like there's also plenty of uncomfortable aspects to being overlearned or like being too tailored to. And I guess that's just a general tension that exists like in many facets of society, like personalized medicine, like it sounds like it's going to be better for you, but like maybe they're going to uncover something about you that you don't really want to deal with on that level. So I'm just kind of curious about that dimension of it. If you have any, I guess that wasn't really a question, but just we talk more about that.
It's a really good point or question, and I think I left Adobe before I came up with the solution. is my bad answer. I think that I think that it's like I totally agree that it's kind of the over tailoring, especially the way that it currently, that we can envision it, is also a future that I don't necessarily want. So I guess it's interesting because my response to it is to kind of pull myself out of it a bit and to make art about it because I don't know the answer from a UX perspective. I wish I had something, kind of more intelligent to say. But I do think that it's, I think that it's maybe an important tension just to accept and to live with for right now, because I think that maybe the whole thing comes down to, when I look at it, I'm comfortable with it because I don't put my faith in those systems, and I'm not pouring myself into those systems because I don't necessarily trust computers and hardware and software. And I guess my hope is that we continue to have that skepticism of our hardware and software, forever, and that maybe we never let it totally take over in representing us, and we find ways to represent ourselves individually. So, by taking more control of our technology from an individual perspective, by learning to program our computers, by learning to write our own software, by learning to get creative in our own ways, rather than streaming ourselves into the tools and the platforms that are being made for us. Being made for us for purposes that aren't necessarily serving us also, right? To sell our data, to sell our likeness, to dump our data into algorithms that are being used for nefarious purposes. So I think that maybe being aware of that and trying to be very kind of forthright and protective of how we are represented and where as individuals is maybe like the solution for now, because I don't know that the UX bit is going to be figured out anytime soon.
Can I respond to this as well? It is a really interesting tension, but at the end of the day, even the personalization is based on an average, right? Because the personalization is based on the average model of what data to even collect to decide that it's you, right? And that I think that the danger that Lisa's talking about is really that some other entity with their own motives and priorities is reflecting you and trying to, extract from you what is essential when you may not even know yourself. Like in terms of self-knowledge, like how many of us could really articulate clearly? So many of these things that are being explored with machine learning and artificial intelligence are trying to do things that we don't even have good answers for ourselves as humans. Like what is reading comprehension for all of the sort of chatbots and like natural language processing tools that are out there. We still don't actually understand. We still have really poor tools for humans to assess next to another human whether they truly understood something. And I think that's kind of the danger. And it's sort of like, when you have the kind of friend who is really good at just mirroring whoever they're with, and it's a little bit off-putting because you're like, I don't know if that's really you. We're used to interacting with other people with their own desires and their own motives, but it's weird it's that uncanny mirror thing. It's weird to interact with this other thing that's supposed to be us. Because we have this natural inclination to love ourselves, to want more of ourselves. But this other thing isn't us, and what's driving that other thing is not us. And as a society, we don't even understand like how we should be representing people. So that's what's weird about it. It doesn't even matter if it's the average or the personalization in either situation. It's problematic. Yeah.
Have you seen this film Belle that came out recently in the last couple of years? It's an anime. It takes place in VR. Everybody gets kind of randomly assigned their avatar based on like their it's like, I forget the exact phrase for it, but it's like biological properties of some form. But it's kind of great because they're just like super chaotic, weird, almost have no relation to reality type avatars. And it's this interesting solution to the problem. I'd recommend checking it out. I've been thinking about it all week, preparing for this. It's a great movie. Avatar 2 is coming out too. Any other questions out there? Okay. Well, if you have some you want to ask specifically, I think we're going to have some drinks now and hang out. So can share them then, or we can just talk about James Cameron. So happy to do that. And thanks for coming. This is great sharing the stage with you too. And thank you.
Thank you, Ryan.